When Aussie kids show Round the Twist was first pitched, it was called disgusting and rejected for being, quote, offensive. I don't know what they're talking about. I mean, that episode where Pete gives birth after being impregnated by a tree, that's a classic. The one where Linda gets chased by a scarecrow that for reasons unknown has a human tongue. Total banger. And of course, who can forget the episode where little Bronson swallows a swirly little fish and it gives him a propeller by way of it lodges itself into an appendage. And he becomes real good at swimming.
You've got a whirling what? He's got a whirly what?
He's got a whirly what?
Bronson, you've got a whirly willy.
Round the Twist is probably the most unhinged thing that Aussie TV has ever produced. So naturally, it became one of the most popular Aussie kids shows of all time in Australia and around the world. But the show almost never existed. In fact, the story behind the scenes is just as crazy as one of the show's episodes. I'd planned to make like a 20-minute video with some fun stories from behind the scenes, but then I found out some truly crazy stuff, like why the UK got to see the entire first season before any Australians did, and multiple failed attempts at a movie, which beloved character was supposed to die, and Disney's entire freak out over bodily fluids. Disney. Oh, and a relationship breakdown behind the scenes that led to an 8-year hiatus in the middle of this 4-season show. Then right in the thick of my research, I find out that Round the Twist is coming back in 2024 in a completely different way. And then I met the guy who's bringing it back. Somewhere along that road, this became a 3-part series. Welcome to Mouldy Media. I'm Nikki, and I like talking about the shows that Aussies grew up watching. So grab yourself a sunny boy, pull up a beanbag, and prepare for the deepest of dives. In this first episode, we're looking at the strange little mind that spawned these stories in the first place, as well as the difficult road to getting the show on the air. Oh, and let's not forget the direct involvement of an international fugitive. I'm not kidding, I'm talking directly involved in making the show happen, and then directly involved in making everybody's life really hard. But before we dive into that, let's first look at what this show is and what makes it so iconic, as a refresher for those who've seen it and an intro for those who haven't. Round the Twist was born from the weird and wacky short stories of Australian author Paul Jennings, whose books became popular with kids in the late 80s. Where his short stories feature strange and spooky things happening to all sorts of different people, it was decided that a central set of characters was needed to make a television show work. So, the Twist family was born. Twins Pete and Linda, their little brother Bronson, and their sculptor dad Tony moved to fictional Port Noranda to live in a lighthouse. Now that's a weird place to live, but as it turns out, that's the least weird thing about this family. The Twists, along with their neighbour Nell, are plagued by strange, spooky, and downright disgusting happenings. Greedy real estate agent, Mr. Gribble, is determined to sell the lighthouse, or develop the area into a water park, or whatever other money-making scheme he's come up with that week. Him and his wife have a delightful son named James, or Gribble Jr. James and his mates Tiger and Rabbit are affectionately known as the Gribble Gang, and they kind of just try and make the Twists' lives a living nightmare, as often as they can. The Gribble's plans are typically foiled, and it's actually often with the help of whatever weird or wacky forces are messing with the Twists that week. The first 2 seasons of the show aired in 1990 and 1992 respectively, but the show didn't return for a 3rd season until the year 2000, and then in 2001 we got the 4th and final season of the show. If you're wondering why you're seeing clips of multiple actors playing the same character, that's because there were multiple recastings. We'll get to the reason for the hiatus and the recastings a little later on. What is it that makes this show so iconic? Well, I think it starts with the fact that every single episode has a completely unhinged plot. Here are some examples. In an episode called Cabbage Patch Baby, Bronson wants to know where babies come from. After discovering a green baby in a cabbage patch, it looks like he's found out. He starts taking care of the infant, but is horrified to discover that if he puts the baby down, it literally stops breathing. The funniest thing about this episode is just how seriously everyone takes Bronson's new fatherhood role. It concludes with a hilarious exchange when the infant's mother and a film crew from another dimension, I guess, confront the Twists. Probably one of my favourite endings to any episode. It's just so unexpected. Speaking of babies, there's an episode where Pete gives birth. Yeah, in the big burp, he pees on a tree, and then this tree spirit girl appears and then kisses him, and I guess that's where babies come from. He burps out a tiny bundle of tree consciousness or something. It's one of the most infamous episodes of the show, and for good reason. In the episode Know All, the Twists find a chest full of circus costumes washed up on the beach. But I guess the clothes are haunted, and when the Twists dress up a scarecrow, it becomes obsessed with Linda, and it has a human tongue. Why? These episodes differ a lot in tone. Sometimes they're scary, sometimes they're spooky, and sometimes they're even a little sad. But they all have one thing in common. They're all completely wacko. So where did this weirdness come from? Who concocted these wackadoo stories in the first place? Well, to understand exactly how this iconic piece of Australian pop culture came to be, we need to go back to the very beginning. Back to where all good stories start. You know, Juvie! In each classroom of the Tirana Youth Training Centre existed a very important button. Now, typical classrooms don't have this button, but typical classrooms have something I like to call functioning door handles. See, the students at Tirana were young offenders and wards of the state, so once they were escorted into their classroom and the door was closed behind them, nobody inside that room could open that door. Even the teacher. Even if kids start throwing hands, even if a wasp gets in. Instead, each classroom was equipped with a panic button. You push the button and security comes a-running. Hastily, I would hope. Particularly if there is a wasp in the room. There is nothing that those suckers like more than an Australian classroom. Prove me wrong. One day in the 60s, a class at Tirana was interrupted when a handcuffed group of boys were pushed into the room. They'd just been arrested for burglary. I know there are some gifted, talented, hardworking teachers out there. But let me tell you, there is no way that what you've got going on is more interesting than Azagaza and Damo, who just hitched a lift to school in the back of a paddy wagon. So naturally, this interruption was followed by a bit of commotion. The teacher tried to restore some order, but it was futile. The students were getting rowdy, things were escalating, and it seemed like violence was becoming inevitable. Then suddenly, the left side of the teacher's chest began tingling. Pins and needles ran up and down his left arm, and his left hand became stuck in like a claw shape. So Paul Jennings pushed the panic button because he was having a heart attack. Spoilers, it wasn't actually a heart attack. It turns out that Jennings experienced a panic attack. And hey, I totally get it. Some eshays approached me on the street once, started speaking to me. I too thought I was going to experience a cardiac event, so Jennings will receive no judgment from me. Not only was Jennings only in his 3rd year of teaching, he was only around 21 and he had no special training outside of a 2-year teaching qualification. I start our story here at Juvie because this is where Paul Jennings discovered his mojo. This is where he found his 11 secret herbs and spices. The secret to writing books so good that kids cannot put them down. Books from which the most unhinged TV series in all of Aussie history would be birthed. Fast forward to 1983. 40-year-old Jennings is on the verge of a breakdown, aren't we all? He was suddenly, and stop me when this sounds familiar, a single father with 4 young children living in a dilapidated house perched on the edge of a wild cliff. A terrifying drop to the swelling Southern Ocean. That quote comes from his memoir, Untwisted, which was a great resource in making this video. Also, just a pleasure to read. I would highly recommend if you're a fan. Also, the guy who narrates the audiobook is the captain of the ship in the TV show Silver Sun. Jennings worked and studied at a university, but now he needed a job where he could spend more time looking after his children. So he decided to publish short stories for kids, because why not? This meant throwing away the job security that he'd been working towards at the university and heading down the very difficult road of getting published, something not many people are able to ever do. But Jennings had a secret weapon. Juvie, or at least what he learned there. Now, it goes without saying that kids who end up in a place like Tirana have been left behind in a lot of ways, not least of which their education. In 2015, Tirana was investigated, along with a few other similar institutions, and it turns out that the treatment that those kids received was pretty terrible. And if the kids' physical safety wasn't a priority, it's no wonder that their rehabilitation and education weren't either. Sure enough, most of the boys Paul Jennings taught were 4 to 5 years below their expected reading level. Tirana didn't provide any extra training or resources for their teachers, but Jennings cared about teaching these kids. They deserved an education, so he found creative ways to get them to learn. And he learned 2 very important things. First of all, it turns out that adolescent boys, they care about what other adolescent boys think of them. Who knew, right? What Jennings figured out is that one of the biggest barriers for a kid that was already way behind was the embarrassment of working out of a book meant for little kids. That's super uncool and all the other kids are going to see, right? So if a kid could only do grade 3 maths, Jennings would just rip the pages out of a grade 3 maths book and then stick it in some other less lame book. And secondly, kids don't care how good a book is if they don't find it interesting in the first place. Jennings got these kids to read, but not from school books. They were reading instructional manuals for model cars and planes, football magazines, gossip magazines, tabloid newspapers, even recipes. He stopped trying to cater to a kid's reading level and instead tried to capture their interest. In Untwisted, he says this: "There is no such thing as a book for reluctant readers. There can only be a book that looks, that is, good enough to capture both proficient and struggling readers." So that became Jennings' goal. When he set out to write short stories for kids, he knew that he had to make them interesting and he had to make them cool. And what do kids find universally interesting and cool? Poop, farts, vomit, and burp. Animal poop, farts, vomits, and burps. Stories so weird or scary that you have to tell your friends about them. Stories that, according to one publisher's rejection letter, were too far out and would offend the gatekeepers of children's literature. I hope he framed that. That's amazing. After a couple of knockbacks from publishers, Jennings found himself in a meeting with Penguin Books. Turns out that Penguin missed that memo from the gatekeepers of children's literature because they offered him a $400 advance and in 1985 unwrapped Unreal, his first collection of short stories, was published. Without a big budget for promotion, Unreal quietly entered bookshops and libraries around the country, but by the end of the year, it was a bestseller. Unreal would be the first of Jennings' short story collections, which would go on to sell around 1 million copies by 1992. Back then, he had no way of knowing what was to come. All he knew was that Unreal was a success because it was popular with the kids who liked reading, but importantly, it was popular with the kids who hated reading. Unreal was also a hit with someone else. Let me introduce you to Dr. Paticia Edgar. There are 2 things that you need to know about Paticia Edgar. First of all, she loves making weird kids shows. So much so that in 1982, she started the Australian Children's Television Foundation so that she could do just that. The second thing you need to know is that when Paticia Edgar wrote her memoir about the years that she spent working in children's TV, making goofy, wholesome shows for the children of Australia, she named it Bloodbath because children's TV is a serious business. And Paticia Edgar is no joke. In all seriousness, her memoir was extremely helpful in putting together this video. I'd recommend it. It's out of print though, so I had to get my copy off eBay. While we're on the topic of sources, in 2017, Aussie author Jenna Guillame put together this amazing oral history of the show. She spoke to a bunch of cast, crew, and the show's creators, and it's just so well put together. In that oral history, Paticia Edgar describes her take on kids' TV like this. I had a complete aversion to the notion that children's programming should be about good role models. There are a hell of a lot of people who were advocates for children's programming who wanted stories that were bland and about nice children. I had not been like that in my childhood. In 1987, Edgar was frustrated. The Foundation was receiving plenty of script application, but they had, in Edgar's words, a remarkable sameness about them. She'd started looking at kids' books, but she found those too message-driven and conventional. Then she read Unreal and immediately invited Paul Jennings out to lunch. Jennings is a pretty shy, quiet guy, so Edgar was surprised when he agreed to let her make a show out of his books, but he wanted to write the episodes. Now, Jennings didn't have any experience writing for television, but Edgar decided to give him a red-hot go. The initial idea that Jennings had for the Twist family was that they would live in a moving house, not like a mystical, magical, apparating house, but like on the back of a truck. That was going to be too expensive, so they scrapped that idea. But when he was a kid, Jennings had found out that he'd had this uncle he'd never met who lived in a lighthouse. And that was a concept that just blew his little kid brain. So that's where the Twist family would live. But the big question was, where was this kooky little show going to live? Who was going to fund a TV show this weird and put it to air in the first place? We're just going to pretend like it hasn't been a week since I filmed that first half of the video and the camera didn't move and the planet-sized pimple that was on my face hasn't gone anywhere. Shockingly, no one was lining up to fund such a weird show. Fortunately, the ACTF could get funding from a recently formed government agency called the Film Financing Corporation. First, they had to sell the show to an Australian TV channel. And secondly, they had to demonstrate that there was international interest in the show. Edgar actually tried to stir up international interest first, but this show was a hard sell on paper. And when she went to an international distributor that she'd worked with before, they said it was too offensive and disgusting and they weren't really interested in it. Oh, I guess there's one more thing you should know about Paticia Edgar. She has friends in high places. That woman knows how to network. Edgar was mates with a woman named Anna Home. Home was the BBC's head of children's programming. So Edgar flew to London, pitched her the show directly, and Anna Home was like, yes, bring the twists and their shenanigans to the UK, please and thank you. Next, Edgar just had to bag an Australian TV channel. And it turns out that she had a friend who was married to the guy who used to own Channel 7. And they introduced her to the guy who currently owns Channel 7. And his name was Christopher Skase. If that name sounds familiar to you, yes, it is that Christopher Skase, and yes, we will get to that later. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry, I didn't know who he was either, but strap in, because his story gets a little crazy later. Skase was a billionaire entrepreneur. I don't know how to say the word entrepreneur, like it sounds weird. Basically, he'd acquired this company called Quintex and then grown it, and it was valued at over $1 billion. And Skase had a reputation for splashing some serious cash. In 1988, he spent over $450,000 on a company Christmas party. Through Quintex, Skase owned these super bougie Mirage resorts, private jets, and the Brisbane Bears. Does anyone remember them? I'm an NRL girly, but I do remember the Brisbane Bears. Edgar pitched the show directly to Skase, who was keen as a bean to have the show for Channel 7. Normally, I'd assume that there'd be some network execs or someone in charge of that sort of thing. It's not like, the guy who owns the channel. But I think this was something Skase just did. And you've got a generous big spender like Skase on board. I mean, what could go wrong? What could go wrong? Let's just put a pin in that, shall we? With all the boxes now ticked, the show got its funding and it was time to start working on season 1. Here are some season 1 highlights. We kick off with Skeleton in the Dunny, where the twists discover that their outdoor toilet is haunted by a ghost. At one point, Pete drops his orthodontic plate down the toilet in fright, and the kids have to go to a sewage treatment plant to rescue it. This episode is based on a short story by the same name from the book Unreal, and the original story is set in a small town called Timboon. Timboon is a real place, and after Unreal was published, Paul Jennings started receiving letters from the people of Timboon informing him that actually they didn't have a sewage treatment plant. But then, plot twist, 15 years later, who gets a sewage treatment plant? Water purification plant. Timboon. And guess who's invited to the ribbon cutting? Yeah, Jennings got to hear the Minister for the Environment read his poo ghost story to everyone in attendance. Name another author that's ever been invited to the ribbon cutting of a sewage treatment plant. Water purification plant. In the episode Without My Pants, Pete gets cursed and can't stop saying, "without my pants," at the end of every sentence. To demonstrate the influence that this show had, my school had to ban the phrase "without my pants" when they re-aired this episode. I don't think they banned it because it was rude or offensive. I think they banned it because teachers were one without my pants away from absolutely losing their minds. Which is fair enough. This season also gives us the Cabbage Patch Baby episode and the creepy Scarecrow one. This show was filmed in a Melbourne studio, complete with a round internal set, and on location at a real lighthouse in Victoria. The lighthouse featured in the show can be found in a little coastal town named Aireys Inlet. So we've got our iconic plots and a great location. There's just one thing missing: a theme song. And they came up with an absolute banger. Now, I can't play it for you because of the whole copyright situation, but I will link it below when I recommend listening. Alternatively, you could just go and find your closest Australian millennial and ask them. They might not say, "Have you ever felt like this?" They might say, "Who are you? Get away from me." But my point is, they could if they wanted to. It was created by the show's composer, Andrew Duffield, of the Aussie rock band The Models. It was performed by Tamsin West, who played Linda in the first season of the show. The cast and crew had an absolute blast creating these episodes, and they were delivered to Channel 7, ready to be broadcast across the nation and weird out kids and parents everywhere. There was just a tiny $1.5 billion problem. Pop quiz. It's the 80s and you're a billionaire in Australia. You want to buy yourself something nice, Treat yourself. What do you buy? If you answered a television channel, congratulations. In Australia, you've got 3 main commercial TV channels: Channel 7, Channel 9, and Channel 10. And between the years of 1986 and 1987, each of those channels was acquired by a rando billionaire, none of whom had any experience running a TV channel. Let's quickly see how that worked out for these guys, shall we? We'll start with Frank Lowy, co-founder of Westfield, the shopping centres. In 1986, he purchased Channel 10 for about $800 million, most of which I'm guessing he lost, because by 1990, Channel 10 had gone into receivership. Yikes. But believe it or not, Lowy wins because he's the only person on this list that A, is alive, B, never went bankrupt, and C, never went to jail. Good for you, Frankie. In 1987, billionaire Alan Bond bought Channel 9 from billionaire Kerry Packer for about $1 billion. If Kerry Packer regretted selling the network, he needn't have worried. He got it back 5 years later after Alan Bond spectacularly went bankrupt. A few years after that, Bond went to jail for a bit for fraud, and then he passed away in 2015. This brings us to Skase. In 1987, Christopher Skase purchased Channel 7 for around $780 million. Then a couple of years later, his entire empire collapsed and his life went round the I'm sorry, I had to. Things really started to go wrong for Skase when he tried to buy MGM Studios. You know the one with the lion? He was a billionaire with cash to splash. Why not drop $1 billion on a movie studio? Well, it turns out all that cash that he was splashing was borrowed. And old mate had run out of credit. Responsible lending laws? Who's she? Then the economy took a bit of a stumble, and Quintex, well, it did a faceplant. As in, it collapsed completely. So just imagine that you're Paticia Edgar watching this all happen. You'd be freaking out, right? Because along with Quintex's other assets, Channel 7 is in limbo. And not only does Channel 7 have their copy of the show, they also have the exclusive Australian rights for the next 3 years. Edgar wanted those tapes back for her own peace of mind. The fate of the show was completely up in the air. Were they going to start selling off Channel 7's assets? Was Round the Twist going to be sold off in a fire sale? Maybe they just end up sitting around collecting dust for 3 years. Or maybe the next guy decides to use them as a tax write-off. The general manager of Channel 7 was like, actually, if you take those back, you might be in breach of contract. And I imagine Paticia Edgar's response was something like, "Oh, you know what, let me speak to your owner. Oh, I forgot. He's on the run. I'm going to be in on Tuesday to collect those tapes. Thanks, bye." I may have taken some creative liberties there. From what I can understand, The banks took all of Skase's surviving media assets and then rolled them into Channel 7, like a burrito. So it was kept intact and then sold on. And then they got their tapes back, but not a minute before Paticia Edgar said they could. And her fears were completely validated, because as soon as Channel 7 got those tapes back, they promptly sat them on what I imagined to be a very sturdy shelf, where they sat and collected dust for 6 months. Oh, and Skase? Yes, Skase fled the country with his family, all the way to Spain. He became known as one of Australia's most wanted international fugitives, and the centre of an expensive, years-long, international hunt for his secret hidden millions, which he claimed never existed and have never been found. Skase is wanted on around 60 charges, including misappropriation of funds, fraud, I'm just guessing here, but probably like fleeing the country, maybe littering. I don't know. I stopped reading after the first 2 things. Skase avoided extradition for about a decade, although he did end up serving, I think, less than a year's jail time in Spain. He claimed that he was seriously ill and couldn't physically travel back to Australia safely. Aussie journos, the government, the general public all seemed to think that he was lying. So it was a bit awkward when he died from cancer. Do you reckon they included the retraction with the obituary? Or nah. Look, the guy wasn't very popular. The collapse of Quintex affected Australians across the board, not just wealthy investors, but lots of people who lost their jobs. Perhaps then the only thing that I could say in defence of Christopher Skase is that he had solid taste in TV. Not only did he buy Round the Twist, he also bought AFL to Channel 7, as well as Home and Away, which is still airing today. What would Channel 7 even be without Home and Away? What would my grandma watch if not for Home and Away? Well, probably Neighbours, to be honest. I've heard Marissa Cooper's on that show now. What a time to be alive. Speaking of Neighbours, in the 6 months that Round the Twist spent chillin' like a villain on Channel 7 shelves, the entire series aired on the BBC and the UK was loving it. It ranked number 1 in the children's category, and it was more popular than Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which debuted in the UK that same year. In a list of top 10 sitcoms as voted by the women of the UK, Round the Twist ranked 7th. This was a list of sitcoms, not kid shows. It beat out MASH. It was great to see the show taking the UK by storm. But would Australian audiences ever get to see the show? Now imagine for a minute, you're a busy Aussie mum. Through some small miracle, you find 5 minutes to yourself one day. So beverage of choice in hand, you pick up the paper. Oh look, there's an article about Paul Jennings. You recognise that name after the 5th argument that you had with your 9-year-old that no, you can't write your book report on the instruction manual that came with your Super Mario game because your teacher said you have to read a real book. Paul Jennings is the name on the books that your child now chooses to read, on purpose, without argument. So in your opinion, Paul Jennings is the name of a miracle worker. Oh, it says that he's created a TV show. Oh, the Channel 7 has sat on it for 6 months. Why would they do that? Well, at least they're going to air it now, right? At 8:30 on a Sunday morning, the day of rest. They don't think it will compete in a better time slot because not enough people will watch. All right, kids, set your alarms. We're all getting up on Sunday morning before church to watch this twisty show. So basically, after the show was actually scheduled to air, Paul Jennings did an interview talking about his disappointment in Channel 7 and the terrible time slot and them just like sitting on it for 6 months. And let me tell ya, the people of Australia started polishing their pitchforks. I wouldn't be surprised if we ran out of pitchfork polish nationally. Newspapers started receiving letters from concerned Australians. Some people suggested that we replace Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles with Round the Twist. Despite the undesirable time slot, kids and families did tune in, and the show received positive reviews. After its success in Australia and the UK, Season 2 was an easy sell, and this time the ABC was keen to buy the rights. That's the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, Australia's publicly funded network, not the American Disney one. And the ABC was going to put it in an evening slot that would be perfect for families. And this time, there were no billionaires involved at all. But there was a much smaller complication that led to a recast. Season 1 had started filming in early 1989. But thanks to Channel 7's delay in airing the show, and everyone having to wait out the exclusive rights for 3 years, when it came time to make Season 2, it was 1992, which means the kids were like 3 years older. But the characters weren't supposed to be. And I don't know if you've met a kid before, but they kind of grow like weeds. So the decision was made to recast the kids. I had forgotten just how weird Season 2 was until I rewatched it. So here's a rundown of some of the greatest hits. In Little Squirt, the water spirit in a local river thinks Bronson is responsible for one of Gribble's schemes and keeps giving him grief. In the end, the water spirit makes it up to him by helping him win a peeing competition in the school toilets. Is that a thing that boys just do? I didn't grow up with brothers, so I don't have the insider knowledge. This episode has won several awards, and I think it perfectly captures the show at its most relatable. Bronson's feeling of injustice at being blamed for something that he didn't do, the twins not really taking him seriously at first, but then uniting to help him out because nobody messes with their little brother. And let's be honest, we all love it when someone who's been picking on us gets their comeuppance. In Nails, Linda falls for this sensitive new boy at school who mysteriously wears gloves all the time. He eventually reveals what looks like 3 sets of fingernails on each hand, and Linda isn't fazed. But by the end of the episode, we find out that they aren't nails, they're scales. And he's actually a mermaid. Man, boy, merboy. Anyway, he goes off to live with his mermum, and Linda is pretty broken up about it. The show is sometimes criticised for being tonally all over the place, especially in these first 2 seasons, but I enjoy the variety of different episodes that we get. And when I think of my favourite episodes when I was a kid, some of them are a bit sad. In Yuckles, there's these weird, rare mushrooms that can transform and perfectly mimic any object, and Linda and Nell are trying to save their forest from being cut down. There's a horrifying moment where a Yuckle impersonating Linda explodes, and the Gribble Gang thinks it was the real Linda and that it's their fault, and it's just so funny and horrifying all at the same time. But this scene where they show up with what they think is Linda in a Ziploc bag and they're like crying, it's so funny. I can't. It's just so funny. And it will never not be funny to me. I can't explain exactly why, but it is. Season 2 aired in 1992 and it was a massive hit. This time, actually, the UK had to wait. They didn't get it till 93. And boy howdy, did lots of countries want to buy the show now. No one was calling it gross or offensive or too rude. Here's just a selection of the countries that bought the show. Zimbabwe, the Netherlands, the Slovak Republic, did I pronounce that right? Spain. Oh, I wonder if Skase watched it. Do you think he did? Portugal, Albania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Iceland, Korea. I'm guessing South. In Denmark, it was called The Children of the Lighthouse. Japan bought seasons 1 and 2 and aired all 26 episodes at prime time. As it turns out, the appeal of all things gross, strange, and unreal is universal. The phrase, "without my pants," is funny in every translation. The hilarity of bird poop transcends language altogether. And the creepiness of a scarecrow with a tongue is understood by all of mankind, womankind, childrenkind, people kind. The whole team had worked incredibly hard to create a high-quality show that captured the interest of adults and children alike. The point of the show wasn't necessarily to demonstrate that selfishness doesn't pay, or that we should take care of the environment, or even the importance of family. But those universal themes are present in the show as a result of creating characters that feel like real kids, a family that feels like a real family. Every kid knows the injustice of being blamed for something that you didn't do, what it feels like to be bullied or laughed at or not believed, maybe struggling to fit in a new place, suddenly having fatherhood thrust upon you when you find a green baby in a cat. Okay. Maybe not that last one, I guess. This team, this show, had managed to put Australian kids' TV on the world stage, and Aussie kids were keen for more of the show as well. So when Paul Jennings visited their schools, some of them asked, Hey, Mr. Author Paul Jennings, when are we getting more of your TV show? And he said, we're not. The show is done. There is no more. To find out why such a successful series was cancelled in its prime, you're going to have to come back for part 2, because we need to look at what was happening behind the scenes in seasons 1 and 2 that led to this sudden rug pull cancellation. And there's someone that I've been dying to tell you about because he plays a really big role in the creation of the show and also its cancellation and also it coming back. And there's still so much to talk about. The show's later Unhinged series, the attempts at a movie, the 2024 comeback. So I hope to see you in the next installment of our twisty adventure. I'd just like to extend a thank you to anyone who stuck it out this far. It took me a while to film this. Look, I'm a little rusty. I don't know how to end this video. Oh, wait.
You've got a whirling what? He's got a whirly what?
He's got a whirly what?